I still remember the night like it was yesterday, even though it happened years ago. I guess that's what happens when something so terrifying leaves an imprint on your soul. The things I witnessed, the things I heard, it's something that doesn't leave you, no matter how many years pass. It all started when my family moved into that old house on the edge of town. It was a big, creaky thing, built back in the 1800s. And although it had its charm, there was something off about it. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, but I felt it. The heavy atmosphere that hung in the air, the way the wind seemed to wail through the cracks in the walls, it was almost as if the house had a life of its own. At first, I chalked it up to the fact that I had never lived in a house this old before. But that feeling didn't go away. We moved in during the summer, and for the first couple of weeks, everything was fine. It wasn't until one night, when the wind picked up, that things began to shift. I had just gotten into bed, my room bathed in the pale light of the moon filtering through the window, when I heard something, a soft scraping sound coming from downstairs. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, old wood shifting, but then I heard it again, a distinct, dragging noise. My heart began to race. I tried to brush it off, but the sound kept coming, as though someone or something was moving slowly across the floor. I lay there frozen, barely daring to breathe, my eyes wide and fixed on the shadows in the corners of my room. That's when I heard it, a whisper, low, almost like it was coming from the very walls themselves. Leave. It was a word so soft, I almost thought I imagined it. But no, it was there, clear as day. My pulse quickened, and I pulled the covers over my head, praying that it would stop, that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the scraping continued, and that whisper, leave, kept echoing through the room. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was paralyzed with fear. It wasn't until dawn that I dared to leave my room. I rushed downstairs, finding everything in place. Nothing was out of the ordinary, and the house was eerily silent. No one else was awake yet, and it seemed like nothing had happened at all. I convinced myself that it had just been a dream, a nightmare so vivid it felt real. But that was just the beginning. As the days went on, strange things began happening around the house. I'd find things moved, objects that hadn't been touched. Small things at first. Cups on the kitchen counter were knocked over, and doors were left ajar when I knew I'd closed them. But one night, I came home from a friend's house and found the kitchen in complete disarray. Pots and pans were scattered across the floor, and the fridge door was wide open. I knew no one had been in the house except me. I decided it was time to tell my parents. They didn't believe me at first. They thought I was just overreacting to the weird sounds of an old house. But things started to escalate. My dad, a staunch skeptic, began to notice things as well. He'd wake up in the middle of the night to see shadows moving outside his bedroom door. My mom, usually calm and collected, began to get jumpy, saying she felt like someone was always watching her, even when she was alone. One night, we all decided to sit down together and talk about what was happening. It was then that I learned about the history of the house. Apparently, the place had once belonged to a family that mysteriously disappeared without a trace. No one knew what happened to them. The house had been vacant for years before we moved in, and it had a reputation in town. People whispered about strange happenings, about the feeling of being followed when walking by it at night. I hadn't heard any of this before we moved in, but after that conversation, I realized how foolish I had been to ignore the warnings. That night, everything changed. I woke up in the middle of the night, my body covered in a cold sweat. The air was thick, and the oppressive silence in the house was suffocating. I heard the scraping again. It was louder this time, more deliberate. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I slowly, cautiously got out of bed. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept out into the hallway, the floorboards creaking under my weight. I didn't know what I expected to find, but I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Downstairs, in the dim light of the kitchen, I saw a figure. A shadowy, indistinct form that hovered just in the corner of the room. It wasn't a person, at least not in the way I understood it. It was more like a presence, something that shouldn't have been there. The air around it shimmered with a cold, unnatural energy, and I could feel it watching me. I froze, unable to move or speak as I stared at this thing, this entity, and then it spoke. A voice so deep, so filled with malice, it sent a chill straight through my bones. Get out. The words were cold, heavy, and full of a hunger I couldn't comprehend. It was as if the house itself was telling me to leave, to never come back. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I ran. I bolted up the stairs, my mind racing, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I slammed the door behind me, locking it, and for the first time in my life, I was truly afraid. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My parents had been up before me, and they seemed just as shaken. My dad had seen it too, something he couldn't explain. He said he had been standing in the kitchen when he felt a cold gust of wind rush past him, and then he saw it, the same shadow that I had seen. Only this time, it was closer, right in front of him. We decided to leave the house that day. I don't think any of us could have stayed another night. We packed our things, leaving everything behind, and we never spoke of it again. But it wasn't over. Even though we moved out, the haunting continued. Months later, I received a call from a friend who had stayed in the house after we left. He told me that things had only gotten worse. The shadows were more aggressive now, and people who visited said they could hear whispers in the walls, see figures watching them from the corners of the rooms. No one stayed for long. In the end, the house was abandoned once again, left to rot in silence. I don't know what happened to that house or what it was that haunted it. But I know what I felt, I know what I saw, and I know that some things are better left undisturbed. Maybe there's more to the old stories, the warnings people give you. Maybe there's something to the things we can't explain. I don't know if I'll ever find the answers, but I know this. Some places, some things, are better left alone.
Next story.
I used to think I was immune to things like fear. Growing up in a small town, you hear all the ghost stories, the spooky tales of haunted houses and cursed objects, but none of them ever really seemed real. I always shrugged them off, telling myself that they were just stories to keep kids from wandering off or staying up too late. I wasn't afraid of anything until I came across something that couldn't be explained away, something that still haunts me to this day. It all started with a trip to an old antique store in town. The kind of place that smells of dust and age, with trinkets piled high and forgotten treasures shoved into corners. It was one of those stores where you could feel the weight of history in the air, and the moment you stepped inside, it was as if the present time faded away. The owner was an older man, graying at the temples, and his eyes always seemed to have a glint of something unsettling. But he was harmless, or so I thought. One rainy afternoon, I found myself browsing through the store on a whim. I had never been particularly interested in antiques, but something drew me in that day. I spent hours picking through boxes of old photographs, tarnished silver spoons, and dusty books. That's when I saw it. It was a small, weathered box tucked away on a shelf in the back corner of the store. The wood was chipped, and there were strange carvings etched into the surface, symbols I didn't recognize. It was simple, yet there was something about it that made me feel uneasy. At first, I didn't think much of it until I touched it. The moment my fingers brushed against the box, a strange sensation coursed through my body. It was like a shock of electricity, only colder, like ice running through my veins. I quickly pulled my hand away, my heart pounding in my chest, but something about the box wouldn't let me walk away. It called to me, pulling me in, like a magnet drawing me closer. The store owner noticed me lingering near the box and shuffled over, his eyes gleaming with something I couldn't quite place. "You're interested in that one?" he asked, his voice raspy. I nodded, still unsure of why I felt so drawn to it. "How much is it?" The man's lips curled into a smile, but there was something off about it. "That one's not for sale," he said, his voice dropping lower. "It's special." I raised an eyebrow. "Special?" "Some things are best left undisturbed," he said, his tone almost a warning. But I didn't listen. I was too curious. I had to know more. Without thinking, I handed over a few bills, convincing him to sell it to me. He hesitated for a moment, then handed it over, almost as if he had no choice. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a mistake. I placed the box on my bedside table, staring at it in the dim light of my room. The carvings seemed to shift when I looked at them, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just my imagination running wild. But I couldn't. I couldn't look away. I remember it clearly. At exactly midnight, I heard a soft clicking sound coming from the box. It was subtle at first, like a small mechanism inside it was moving, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, staring at the box. The lid of the box began to tremble, slowly rising on its own as though something inside was pushing against it. I should have run. I should have screamed. But I didn't. I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from what was happening. The box was opening. And then I saw it. A dark, swirling mist poured out of the box, spreading like ink spilling across water. It was thick and black, coiling in the air, and the temperature in the room dropped so quickly I could see my breath. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The mist seemed to have a life of its own, curling around the edges of the room, filling every corner with an unnatural chill. The worst part? I could hear voices. Whispers, soft at first, then growing louder. They were unintelligible at first, just jumbled noises, but then the words began to form, clear as day. Come to us. Join us. Stay with us forever. The whispers were cold, empty, and as I listened, a sense of dread washed over me. I could feel something pulling at me, something that wanted me to come closer, to step into the mist. My body screamed for me to run, but I was frozen, trapped in place, unable to do anything but watch as the mist swirled around me. I don't know how long I stood there, caught between terror and curiosity before the mist slowly began to dissipate, but it didn't vanish completely. A shadow remained, lingering in the corner of the room, watching me. I could feel its presence, like it was waiting for something, for me to make a move, to acknowledge it. That's when I heard the knocking. It was faint at first, like someone tapping on the window, but it grew louder, more insistent. I spun around, my heart pounding. There was no one there, but the knocking continued as if it were coming from inside the walls. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the box and rushed out of the room, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it. I shoved the box into the back of my closet, hoping to lock it away, to forget about it, but it didn't end there. The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and strange occurrences. I'd hear things moving in the house when no one was there. My reflection in the mirror started to look wrong, distorted, like someone else was standing behind me. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, followed by something that wasn't human. One night, after a particularly terrifying dream, I decided I couldn't keep running. I had to face whatever was in that box. I grabbed it from the closet and opened it one last time. The mist poured out once more, but this time something was different. I felt it, felt the presence in the room, stronger than before. Something reached out of the box, something that wasn't just a mist, but something darker, more malevolent. It hovered in the air, a shape forming before my eyes. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, its eyes glowing like embers in the dark. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper, it was a scream, a loud, piercing sound that rattled my bones. You shouldn't have opened it. I tried to close the box, tried to force it shut, but it wouldn't close. The thing in the room was getting closer, and I could feel its cold breath on my skin. That's when I made the decision. I ran. I don't know what happened to the box after that. I threw it into the river, hoping the water would carry it away, take it out of my life for good. But I'm not sure it worked. The voices still come to me sometimes, late at night, when the house is silent. And when I close my eyes, I see the shadow, waiting in the corner of the room, always watching. Sometimes I wonder if the box ever really left, if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to find it.
Next story.
I still don't know exactly what happened that night. It's one of those things you try to push out of your mind, but it lingers, haunts you. I've tried to forget, to pretend it was just some strange nightmare, but deep down, I know it wasn't. It was real. I had just turned 18, fresh out of high school, and my friends and I were looking for something exciting to do, something that would mark the beginning of adulthood. We had all heard about the old St. Mere, Mark's church on the edge of town. People said it was cursed, that it had been abandoned for years, and that anyone who ventured there after dark never came back the same. Naturally, it was the perfect challenge for us. Teenagers always think they're invincible. The church had been built back in the late 1800s, and the stories about it had been passed down for generations. They said the priest who had once served there had gone mad, performing strange rituals in the dead of night. Eventually, he disappeared without a trace, and the church was abandoned. Some said he was still there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for someone to come inside. Others said the spirits of those who had died in the church still roamed the halls, trapped in the decaying walls. We didn't really believe in any of that. We thought it was all just a bunch of old ghost stories. But that didn't stop us from being curious. One Friday night, when the air was thick with fog and the moon hung low in the sky, we decided to make our way to the church. There were 6 of us: my best friend Jess, her cousin Adam, my neighbor Mark, his girlfriend Haley, and another friend Ryan, along with me. We piled into Ryan's car, all of us eager to prove that we weren't afraid of some old building. When we arrived, the church loomed in front of us, shrouded in darkness. The doors were wide open, as though it were expecting us. The windows were broken, and the stone steps were cracked and crumbling beneath our feet. It was eerie, and for the first time, a sense of unease washed over me. But I didn't let it show. We were here for the thrill of it, right? We gathered in front of the doors, half joking about how it was all just some silly superstition. But none of us made a move to step inside right away. The air felt thick, as if something unseen was watching us. I could hear my own heartbeat in the silence, a rhythmic thumping in my chest. It was Jess who pushed the door open, her voice shaky but trying to sound brave. "Let's go," she said. "What's the worst that could happen?" None of us answered. We just followed her inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and mildew. The inside of the church was dark, save for the faint light that filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The pews were rotted, and the altar was covered in dust, like it hadn't been touched in decades. The place felt wrong. The kind of wrong that crawls under your skin and makes every hair on your body stand on end. We split up to explore. Ryan and Mark went toward the back of the church, while Adam and Haley wandered down a narrow hallway that led to what used to be the priest's quarters. Jess and I stayed by the altar, both of us trying to act casual, but I could feel my nerves starting to fray. Then it happened. I heard a sound, soft at first, like something dragging across the floor. Jess didn't seem to hear it at first, but I froze, listening intently. The sound grew louder, like the scraping of metal on stone. I looked around, but there was nothing, just shadows. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Jess. She frowned, shaking her head. "It's just the wind. It's probably just the place settling." But I knew better. There was something off about the way the sound didn't stop, didn't echo, like it was following us. Then, from down the hallway, I heard a voice. It was faint, like a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "Leave." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I felt the blood drain from my face. It wasn't one of us. None of us had spoken. I looked at Jess, and she was pale too. "Let's go," I said, my voice trembling, but as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Panic set in. We tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the church was holding us captive. From the corner of my eye, I saw movement, shadows flitting across the walls, darting around us like they were alive. And then came the laughter. It was low, almost a growl, echoing through the church, filling the space with a sense of impending doom. The laughter was joined by the sound of something or someone shuffling across the floor. I spun around, but there was nothing there. "Did you hear that?" Jess asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, too scared to speak. We were trapped. There was no escape. The church seemed to be alive, closing in on us. That's when the shadows in the back of the church began to take shape. Figures appeared, tall and gaunt, their faces hidden in the darkness. I couldn't make out their features, but I could feel them staring at me, their eyes glowing like burning coals. They moved slowly, dragging their feet, their limbs twisting in unnatural angles. "Get out!" The voice was louder now, a guttural growl filled with anger and desperation. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt the walls closing in. I turned to run, but Jess stopped me. She grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "No, we can't," she said, her voice frantic. "We're not alone. They'll keep us here. They'll never let us leave." "Who?" I gasped, barely able to speak. "The priest," she said, her eyes wide with terror. He's still here. He's watching us. The ones who enter, they never leave." That's when I saw it. At the far end of the church, standing in front of the altar, was a figure. A man dressed in the tattered robes of a priest. His face was hidden in shadows, but I could see his eyes, two dark, hollow pits, empty and full of rage. His mouth opened, and I could hear the words, thick with malice, "Leave this place, or join me forever." I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. The air around me felt thick, suffocating. The shadows were closing in. The laughter, the whispers, it was all around us. And then, as if on cue, we all turned and bolted for the door. We didn't stop to look back. We ran, sprinting through the church, through the hallway, out into the night, the air cold and crisp against our skin. The door flew open with a force that sent us stumbling out into the yard. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the car. As Ryan slammed the door shut, I glanced back at the church. The lights inside had gone out, but the figure he was still there, standing in the doorway, watching us. We never went back, and we never spoke of that night again. But I can still hear the voice sometimes, faintly in my dreams. Leave.
Next story.
I grew up in a small town, surrounded by dense woods and steep hills that seemed to go on forever. My family lived in a house that sat on the outskirts, close to those woods. It was a modest home, nothing extravagant, but it had been in the family for generations. My father was a quiet man, never one to speak much about the past, and my mother was kind and loving, but often seemed distracted, like she was lost in her own thoughts. Growing up, I never really understood why my parents were so serious about certain things. They always had rules about never going into the woods alone, about never staying out after dark, and most of all, about never going near the old well in the forest behind our house. I remember the first time I was old enough to question these rules. I was about 12, and I had been playing outside when I noticed something strange. The air around the woods seemed different that day, thicker somehow, and as I stood there staring at the tree line, I felt a pull, an invisible force tugging me toward it. I had heard the stories, of course. The town was filled with old legends, whispers about a presence in the woods, a force that was said to be older than the town itself. People spoke in hushed tones about the things that happened there, about strange noises in the night, about people who had disappeared without a trace. But I never thought much of it. After all, I was just a kid, and kids love a good mystery, right? So against everything my parents had told me, I decided to explore the woods. I sneaked out one afternoon, telling them I was going to the store. I made my way to the edge of the forest, where the trees loomed tall, their branches thick and gnarled. It was quieter than I expected, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. The further I ventured in, the more the air seemed to change. The sunlight barely pierced through the canopy, casting long, jagged shadows on the ground. The feeling of being watched crept up my spine, but I shrugged it off as paranoia. Then, I saw it. The old well. It was hidden deep in the woods, far from the path my parents had warned me about. It was a crumbling stone structure, covered in vines and moss, as if it had been there for centuries. The stone was slick with dampness, and the well itself seemed to be breathing, as if it had a life of its own. The moment I saw it, I felt a chill in the air, something cold and ancient that made me hesitate. My feet moved against my will, and before I knew it, I was standing at the edge, peering down into the blackness. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling in the silence. No response, just the faint echo of my own words bouncing off the stone walls. I took a step back, then another, but something inside me kept me rooted there. I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to know more. I had to understand what it was that pulled me here, what it was that had been hidden from me for so long. That's when I heard it. A whisper, soft at first, then louder. It sounded like a voice, but not a human voice, more like something old, something ancient, something that had been buried for a long time. "Help me." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The voice wasn't just in my head, it was coming from the well. I took a hesitant step closer, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around me, but all I could hear was the voice. I leaned over the edge, peering into the darkness below. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it, a pale, skeletal hand reaching up from the depths of the well. It was slow at first, then more urgent, as though it were trying to pull itself out, desperate to escape. My legs went weak, and I stumbled back, tripping over a root. The hand disappeared into the shadows, but the voice continued, louder now, almost frantic. "Help me. Don't leave me here." I ran. I didn't stop, not until I was safely back at home, panting and covered in sweat. When I finally made it inside, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to calm my racing heart. I had seen something that wasn't supposed to be there. But what was it? Who was it? And why had it spoken to me? I couldn't shake the image of that hand reaching out from the darkness. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a noise outside my window. A soft scraping sound like something was dragging along the ground. My mind raced and my heart skipped a beat. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to ignore it, but the sound persisted, getting closer and closer. Then, a soft knock on the window. "Help me." The voice was clear now, and it sent a wave of icy dread through me. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was just the wind, or maybe some animal in the trees. But deep down, I knew. I knew that whatever was outside wasn't just some animal. The next morning, I found my mother sitting at the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she held a cup of coffee. She looked up at me with a haunted expression, her eyes filled with fear. She didn't need to say anything. I could see it in her face. She knew. She had known all along. "I told you not to go there," she said, her voice trembling. "I told you about the well." I didn't understand at first. Why had she never told me more? Why hadn't she warned me about what it really was? She told me then, in a voice so low I could barely hear her, about the curse of the well. The well had been there long before our family ever moved into the house. It was built by the town's founders, who had made a dark pact with an entity that lived in the woods. They had used the well to trap the creature, to keep it imprisoned. But over time, the creature's power grew, and the town started to change. People began to disappear. Strange things started happening. The town, once full of life, slowly withered, and those who remained spoke of strange voices calling out from the forest, of shadowy figures watching from the trees. And now it had found me. My mother told me that it was my bloodline that had been chosen. My family had always been the keepers of the secret, the ones who had to keep the well sealed. It was an ancient curse, passed down through generations, and it had chosen me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop it. I felt the weight of the curse pressing down on me, heavy and suffocating. The voice in the well had been calling me, and I knew that it wouldn't stop until it had me. That night I tried to sleep, but the whispers continued. They filled my head, echoing through every corner of my mind. I could hear it, feel it, as if it was standing right next to me. The thing in the well wasn't going to let me go. It was waiting. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the sound of footsteps. Heavy, dragging footsteps, like something was coming for me, slowly, relentlessly. And then, nothing. When I woke up, I was standing at the edge of the well again. It was calling me.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural. I always thought those stories were exaggerated, just the imagination of people who watch too many horror movies. But after what happened to me, I don't know what to believe anymore. It all started a few months ago when I moved into an old house in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. It wasn't exactly a mansion, but it was large enough for me to get lost in. The rent was cheap, and the landlord seemed nice enough, an older gentleman who didn't ask many questions. The house had been empty for a long time, so I figured it had just been neglected. I didn't think much of it, but now, looking back, I wish I had trusted my instincts. I first noticed something was off on the night I moved in. I had just finished unpacking most of my things and was taking a break when I heard it, the sound of footsteps upstairs. At first, I assumed it was the creaking of the old floorboards or the wind, but it was so distinct. There were no other neighbors nearby, and I hadn't seen anyone else in the house, so I chalked it up to my imagination. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, slow, heavy steps on the stairs. I called the landlord the next morning, but he assured me the house was empty and that no one had been up there for years. "Old houses creak," he said, as if that explained everything. I wanted to believe him, so I did. But the footsteps didn't stop. The next few weeks were filled with strange occurrences. At first, it was little things. Doors that would be slightly ajar when I was sure I had closed them, flickering lights that I couldn't fix no matter what I did. But then it escalated. I began to hear whispers, soft, unintelligible voices in the dead of night, coming from behind the walls. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the house settling or the pipes, but as the whispers grew louder and more distinct, I started to wonder if something was seriously wrong. One evening, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I crept through the dark hallways, listening for any sign of life. I checked every room, nothing. I even checked the attic, but all I found was dust and old boxes. But when I returned to the main hallway, I heard it. The whispers, clearer now. They weren't coming from the walls, but from the staircase. The same staircase I had heard the footsteps on. I froze, too terrified to move. The air grew cold, and I could see my breath in the dim light of my flashlight. I looked up, and I saw it, a shadow standing at the top of the stairs, a figure dark and featureless staring down at me. My heart stopped. I didn't know what to do. My legs wouldn't move, and my throat went dry. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me. Then the whispers grew louder, as if urging me to come closer. I don't know what possessed me, but I took a step forward. As soon as I did, the figure disappeared into thin air, and the house fell into an eerie silence. I rushed back to my room and locked the door, hoping to wake up and realize it was all a nightmare. But it wasn't. Over the next few days, I did some research on the house's history. It was an old place, built in the late 1800s. The original owner, a man named Samuel Reed, had lived there with his family. According to local records, Samuel was a reclusive man who disappeared without a trace one winter night, leaving behind a wife and 2 children. They say he was never seen again, and after that, strange things began happening in the house. Unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, and some even claim to have seen the figure of a man in the windows. I couldn't shake the feeling that Samuel Reed's spirit was somehow connected to the house, and that he was still trapped here. The more I dug, the more unsettling things became. There were reports from previous tenants, each one telling stories of strange noises, shadows, and inexplicable feelings of dread. Most of them had left after only a few months, and the house had stood empty for years. I began to wonder why the landlord never mentioned any of this. Was he hiding something? That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers were louder now, almost as if they were trying to get my attention. They didn't sound like voices, though. They sounded more like a chant, a rhythmic mumbling that seemed to come from every direction. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. I could feel it, whatever it was, getting closer, surrounding me. My heart was pounding in my chest as I pulled the covers over my head, hoping to block out the sound. Suddenly, the door to my room creaked open. I felt the cold air rush in, and I could hear footsteps moving toward my bed. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. I was too terrified to move, too frozen to scream. I felt the presence. Something was standing over me, just inches away, but when I looked, there was nothing there. The door slammed shut, and I could hear it again, the footsteps. This time, they were coming down the hallway, slowly, deliberately. I crept out of bed and grabbed a kitchen knife, my only form of protection. I had no idea what I was supposed to do, but I knew I had to face whatever was tormenting me. I cautiously opened the door and stepped into the hallway, the flashlight shaking in my hand. As I walked down the stairs, I heard a voice, clear but filled with malice. "You shouldn't be here," it said, and then the lights went out. I was in complete darkness. My breath was shallow, and every muscle in my body tensed as I listened for the sound of movement. That's when I heard it, a voice so close I could feel its breath on my neck. "Leave. Now." I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the presence behind me, just waiting for me to make a move. I spun around, but there was no one there. I turned back to the stairs, but the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. And then, suddenly, the whispering stopped. The air grew warm, and for a brief moment, everything felt calm. Too calm. I knew it wasn't over. I ran to the door, almost tripping over my own feet as I desperately pulled it open. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, I saw something I'll never forget. At the window, I saw the figure of a man staring at me with hollow eyes. It was Samuel Reed. He was trapped inside, watching me leave. I didn't go back. I couldn't. The next day, I gathered all my things and left the house for good. I never spoke to the landlord again, and I never found out what happened to the house or to the spirits inside. But I know one thing for sure. Some houses are better left alone.
Next story.
It was a cold autumn evening when I first moved into the old farmhouse. I had just broken up with my fiancée, and I needed a fresh start. I found the house online. a little piece of rural property that promised peace and solitude. The rent was surprisingly cheap, and I thought I'd found a hidden gem. The landlady was an elderly woman who barely spoke when I met her, but she was kind enough. She told me the house had been in her family for generations, and that she was simply looking for someone to care for it. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, setting up the house the way I wanted it. The house was large, with old wooden floors and creaky staircases. The walls were adorned with faded wallpaper that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But it had character, and that's what I liked about it. It felt like home. On the third night, I began to notice something strange. As I sat in the living room reading, I heard soft thuds coming from upstairs. I assumed it was just the house settling, as old houses tend to do. But the noises grew louder, more deliberate. It was a rhythmic thumping, like someone walking slowly around up there. I decided to investigate, but when I climbed the stairs, the noise abruptly stopped. I searched every room, but there was nothing out of place. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered in the air. It was unsettling, but I shrugged it off. I was alone in a big house, and I was probably just letting my mind get the best of me. The following night, the noise returned. This time, it was louder, almost as if the personares was moving furniture. I grabbed a flashlight and crept up the stairs again. I could hear the sound getting closer, but when I reached the top, it was silent. I searched the rooms, finding nothing, but a cold draft seemed to sweep through the hallway. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't know what to make of it, but I left the upstairs and returned to my room, locking the door behind me. The next day, I called the landlady. She seemed unfazed when I told her about the noises. "Old houses have their quirks," she said. "Nothing to worry about." I wasn't so sure. That night, the thumping started again, this time accompanied by strange whispers. The whispers were faint at first, like a distant conversation I couldn't quite make out. But as the night went on, the voices became clearer, though still unintelligible. It sounded as though there were multiple voices, all speaking in unison, chanting something I couldn't understand. The hairs on my arms prickled and my heart raced. I didn't want to investigate this time. I stayed in my room, hoping the noises would stop. They didn't. The following week, I decided to look into the history of the house. I went to the local library and asked the librarian about it. She looked at me with a strange expression, as if she knew something I didn't. She told me that the farmhouse had a tragic past. The original owner, a man named George Thompson, had lived there with his wife and 2 children. One night, they disappeared without a trace. The townspeople believed George had gone mad and murdered his family, but no evidence was ever found to confirm it. After the incident, the house had been abandoned for many years, until the landlady's family took ownership of it. I didn't know what to make of the story. But as I left the library, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The noises had become louder, more frequent, and the whispers were growing clearer with each passing night. I could almost make out words now, phrases that sent a chill down my spine. "Leave this place. You don't belong here. He's coming." I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The presence in the house grew stronger, more oppressive. It wasn't just the noises anymore, it was a feeling of being trapped. The air became thick with dread, and no matter where I went in the house, it followed me. One night, after hours of the incessant whispers, I couldn't take it any longer. I grabbed a flashlight and went up to the attic. The attic had always felt strange to me, cold and musty, filled with old furniture and forgotten relics from a time long past. I had avoided it, but tonight, I had to know what was going on. As I climbed the ladder to the attic, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. The air was thick, and it was hard to breathe. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. That's when I saw it, a figure standing motionless in the corner of the attic. It was tall, almost skeletal, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. It wore a tattered coat, and its skin was as pale as the moonlight. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching me. The whispers grew louder, now filling my mind. "You shouldn't be here," the voice said, echoing in my ears. I tried to speak, but my mouth was dry and no words came out. I took a step back, but my foot caught on something and I stumbled. The figure's eyes seemed to burn into me, and I felt an icy chill seep into my bones. Then, without warning, it lunged toward me. I screamed and scrambled down the ladder, tripping over my own feet in panic. As I reached the bottom, I heard the figure's footsteps behind me, following me down the stairs. The whispers were deafening now, surrounding me, suffocating me. I bolted for the front door, throwing it open and running outside into the cold night air. I didn't look back. I didn't return to the house after that night. I packed my things and left, never once considering going back. I moved in with a friend and tried to put the events behind me, but the memory of the figure in the attic haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was still waiting there in that old house. A few weeks later, I heard that the house had burned down in a mysterious fire. No one was sure how it started, but they said it was completely engulfed by flames. The landlady moved away, and I never heard from her again. To this day, I wonder if the house was truly abandoned, or if it was just waiting for the right person to come along.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts. Growing up, I thought it was all a bunch of stories people told to scare each other. But that all changed when I moved into the house on 6th Street. It wasn't much, a small 2-bedroom with creaky floor and an old furnace that rattled like it might give up any minute. But it was cheap, and I needed something affordable. I'd been living in the city for a few months now, struggling to make ends meet, so the place seemed like a godsend. The first few days were fine. I went about unpacking my things, settling into the house, and trying to get used to the isolation. My neighbors were quiet, and the area, though old, felt safe enough. But there was something off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It wasn't the house itself, but something about it. Every night when the sun dipped below the horizon, a strange unease would settle over me. It was like the house itself was watching me. It started with little things. Doors that I could have sworn I'd closed open when I came back from the kitchen. The sound of footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. The first time I heard it, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks. But when it happened again and again, I began to feel like I was never alone. Then, one night, I woke up to a feeling of coldness. I opened my eyes, but the room was pitch black. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand, but before I could touch it, I felt it. Cold fingers brushing against my skin. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the weight of something or someone standing just inches from my face. But when I snapped the light on, nothing was there. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just a nightmare. But then things started getting weirder. The temperature in the house would drop inexplicably. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find the bathroom light on, even though I was sure I'd turned it off before going to bed. I started hearing whispers too. They were faint at first, like distant murmurs from another room, but then they grew louder, like someone was speaking right behind me. One evening, after hearing footsteps again, I decided to do something I had never done before. I called in a paranormal investigator. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but when the guy showed up, he was serious. He set up cameras and recorded equipment, asking me to show him where I'd been hearing the footsteps. I didn't know what I expected him to find, but when he started talking to the air, asking for any spirits to reveal themselves, I couldn't help but laugh. I mean, this guy was talking like he was going to have a conversation with a ghost. But then, the room got cold. I'm not talking about a slight chill. I'm talking about a freezing cold that made my breath fog in the air. And then it happened. There was a loud thud, like something heavy had been thrown across the room. We both froze, looking at each other in shock. The investigator's face went pale, and he grabbed his equipment, muttering to himself, "We need to leave. Now." I didn't argue. We packed up, and I followed him out the door, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, scratching sounds from the walls, whispers that seemed to crawl up my spine. I didn't know what to do anymore. It was clear something was in that house, something that didn't want me there. But I wasn't ready to give up. I couldn't. That's when I started to look into the history of the house. I went down to the local library, hoping to find some answers. After hours of digging through old records, I found something disturbing. The house had once been owned by a family, mother, father, and a young girl. The father was a drunk, the mother was neglected, and the little girl was often locked away in her room. The neighbors said they heard strange noises from the house late at night, but no one ever really investigated. It wasn't until the family disappeared that anyone thought something was wrong. The house sat abandoned for years after that, no one wanting to go near it. I didn't know what happened to the family, but it didn't take much to put the pieces together. The girl, she had died in the house alone, locked in her room. The whispers, the footsteps, the coldness, it all made sense now. I wasn't dealing with one ghost. I was dealing with something far worse. A trapped soul, forever lingering in the dark corners of that house. I decided I had to leave. I packed my things, but when I tried to leave the house, the door wouldn't open. I pushed and pulled, but it was like it was locked from the inside. I could feel something watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I started to panic. I ran from room to room, trying every window, every door, but they were all sealed shut. The air was thick, suffocating, and the whispers grew louder. I was trapped. Then I saw her. The little girl, standing at the end of the hallway. Her pale face was barely visible, but I could see her eyes, wide and hollow, staring right at me. She didn't speak, but I could hear her voice in my head, faint but unmistakable. "Leave," she whispered. "Leave now." I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran for the back door, clawing at the handle, desperate to get out. When I finally threw the door open, the cold air hit me like a slap in the face. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran all the way to my car and didn't stop until I was miles away from that house. It's been months since that night, but I can't shake the feeling that she's still there. I've heard stories from other people who moved into that house after me. They said they experienced the same things: footsteps, whispers, cold spots, but no one ever lasts long. They always leave, just like I did, and I know why. The little girl, the one who died alone in that house, is still there, waiting for anyone to listen. But I've learned the hard way. Some stories are better left untold. Some ghosts are better left undisturbed.
Next story.
I never thought much about the old mansion at the end of the street. It had been abandoned for years, the windows boarded up and the yard overgrown with weeds. People in the neighborhood used to talk about it, mostly in whispers, but I never paid much attention. Until that one day. It was late autumn, and I had just moved into a small house nearby. I was new to the area, trying to settle in, when I noticed something odd. The mansion's windows, which had been covered for as long as I could remember, were now open. No one had been seen going in or out, but the eerie feeling the place gave off was unmistakable. Still, I convinced myself it was just a coincidence, a draft maybe, or a broken board finally giving way. That evening I went for a walk. The air was crisp and the streets were unusually quiet. As I passed the mansion, I felt a pull, an unexplainable urge to go closer. My feet led me to the wrought iron gate, which, to my surprise, was slightly ajar. The yard was still wild, but there was a path leading to the front door. Something inside me told me to turn back, but I ignored it, pushing the gate open and stepping onto the path. The house loomed ahead, its stone exterior worn and chipped, yet somehow still standing proud. As I approached the front door, I felt a coldness in the air, despite the warmth of the evening. The door creaked open as though it had been expecting me. I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing in my chest, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped inside. The entry hall was massive, dark wood paneling lining the walls and a grand staircase spiraling upward. The air inside smelled musty, like old books and dampness, but there was something more, a heaviness. It felt as if the house itself was alive, watching me. I shouldn't have stayed. I should have turned around then and walked out, but something was keeping me there. I ventured further in, my footsteps echoing in the vast silence. The walls were adorned with faded portraits, their eyes following me as I moved. A chill ran down my spine, but I kept going. I didn't know why, but I felt like I had to. The house seemed endless. Room after room, each darker and colder than the last. I passed through what appeared to be a library, the shelves stacked high with dusty books. There was a strange, almost oppressive quiet in the air, and I felt as though I were intruding on something that didn't want to be disturbed. I finally found myself standing in front of a large door at the end of a narrow hallway. It was ajar, and I could see a faint light glowing from within. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but once again I ignored them and pushed the door open. Inside was a room unlike the others. It was immaculately kept, as though someone still lived there. The furniture was antique, covered in rich fabrics, and the fireplace was still burning, despite the warmth of the house. On the mantel was a clock, its ticking loud in the otherwise silent room. But it was the painting that caught my eye. Above the fireplace hung a large portrait of a woman, dressed in a dark gown, her face pale and expressionless. Her eyes seemed to pierce through me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I stared at the painting for too long, unable to tear my gaze away. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something moving, a shadow. It flickered across the far wall, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I was beginning to feel dizzy, as though the air itself was thickening around me. Suddenly I heard a voice, a low whisper as soft as the wind coming from behind me. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no one there. But the voice, it lingered in my mind, echoing through the room. It was as though it had come from the painting, from the woman in the portrait. My breath caught in my throat. The eyes of the woman in the painting, they were no longer fixed on the viewer. They were following me. The eyes seemed to shift, narrowing as I took a step back. In a panic, I turned and rushed for the door, but as soon as I reached for the handle, it slammed shut. I could feel the walls closing in, the air growing heavier, suffocating. I turned to find the room had changed. The furniture was now covered in dust, and the fire had gone out, leaving only the cold ashes. The clock on the mantel was still ticking, but now its sound was deafening, like a drumbeat in my ears. I tried the door again, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, swirling around me. The room began to feel alive, like it was pulsing with a malevolent energy. I could see shadows moving in the corners, flickering just out of reach. The portrait of the woman was no longer still. She was moving, her expression twisting into something dark and twisted. Her mouth opened, her lips curling into a smile that wasn't a smile at all. It was a grimace, a mockery of joy. And then she spoke. "You shouldn't have come," she repeated, her voice cold as ice. "Now you'll stay." The room began to distort, the walls stretching and warping. The shadows grew longer, closing in around me. I was frozen, unable to move, as though the very air itself was holding me in place. Then, a hand touched my shoulder, cold and clammy. I turned, and there she was. The woman from the painting, standing in front of me, her face twisted in a grotesque grin. Her eyes, those eyes, were full of malice. "You're mine now," she whispered, her breath like death on my neck. "You'll never leave." I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the suffocating darkness. The last thing I remember was the clock, its ticking louder than ever as everything around me went black. The next morning, the mansion was just as it always had been, abandoned, forgotten. No one would ever know that I had stepped inside, that I had become another part of its history. And as for me, I'm still here, trapped in the mansion, where the whispers never stop.
Next story.
I moved into the small town of Maple Ridge a year ago, escaping the chaos of the city and looking for a quiet place to start over. The town was charming, with old brick buildings lining the streets and a picturesque park in the center. Everyone I met was kind and welcoming, and it didn't take long before I found myself comfortable in my new life. But there was one thing I could never shake, an unsettling feeling every time I passed the old, crumbling church at the edge of town. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. The stained glass windows were cracked, and the ivy that had grown over the walls seemed to be slowly consuming it. I had always been drawn to it, a strange pull that I couldn't explain. People in town would always tell me to stay away from it, but no one ever said why. They just shrug it off and change the subject whenever I brought it up. One evening, after a long walk through the park, I found myself standing in front of the church. The air was thick with fog, and the setting sun cast an eerie orange glow over the building. My curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to take a closer look. The door was partially ajar, and I pushed it open, the old wood creaking as I entered. The inside was just as decayed as the outside. The pews were broken and scattered, and dust hung in the air like a fog. The once beautiful stained glass windows were shattered, leaving jagged edges that caught the fading light. The altar was empty, but there was something else, something that made my skin crawl. At the back of the church, in the shadows, stood a large, ornate door. It looked out of place, almost as if it had been added later, as though it was hiding something. I couldn't resist. I walked toward it, the floor groaning under my feet with every step. When I reached the door, I hesitated. It was locked, but there was a strange old key hanging from the doorknob, as if it had been left there for someone to find. I took the key, my hand trembling as I inserted it into the lock. The door opened with a low, ominous groan, and I stepped inside. What I saw in that room still haunts me. It was a small, dimly lit chamber, the air thick with mildew. At first, I thought it was empty, but then I noticed the figures. They were barely visible in the dim light, standing motionless against the walls. My heart skipped a beat as I took a step forward, the shadows seeming to move and shift around me. There were 6 figures in total. They were dressed in old, tattered robes, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They stood perfectly still like statues, their bodies unnaturally rigid. But it wasn't their stillness that terrified me. It was the fact that I could feel them watching me. I tried to back away, but the door slammed shut behind me, and the room grew colder. The figures slowly turned their heads, their eyes now visible beneath their hoods. They were not human eyes. They were hollow, black pits, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. One of them spoke, its voice like gravel scraping across stone. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The others remained silent, their hollow eyes never leaving me. "Why are you here?" the figure continued, stepping forward. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something dark and ancient was pressing down on me. The air was thick with it, suffocating. The figure raised a hand, and I instinctively stepped back, but there was no room to move. The walls seemed to close in, and I realized that the room had grown smaller, as if it were shrinking around me. "You are the one," the figure whispered, "the one we've been waiting for." I didn't understand. I had no idea what it meant, what they meant, but I knew I had to get out. I turned and ran toward the door, but the door wouldn't open. I pounded on it, but it was no use. The figures were closing in on me, their hollow eyes filled with malice. I could hear their whispers, soft and unintelligible, like a language I couldn't understand. Then, as if time had stopped, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. Only the dark, empty space of the room and the oppressive silence that followed. But something was different now. I could feel it in the air, a shift, a presence that had not been there before. The room was no longer just a place. It had become a part of me, as though I had been marked. In that moment, I understood. The church, the figures, the whispers, they were not of this world. They had been waiting for me, and now that I had entered, I couldn't leave. The door finally creaked open, and I stumbled out into the night. But as I stepped outside, I realized that the church was no longer the same. The walls had grown taller, the windows darker. It loomed over me, as though it had grown more powerful in my absence. The town of Maple Ridge seemed smaller now, more distant. The streets were empty, and the houses appeared abandoned. As I walked back toward my home, I felt the weight of something watching me, following me. The whispers were still there, lingering in my mind, growing louder with each passing step. I tried to forget about it, tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The people in town started to look at me differently, like they knew something I didn't. And every time I passed that church, I could feel it calling to me, beckoning me to return. The thing is, I didn't realize that I had already become part of it. The church had claimed me, and I was no longer free.
Next story.
It started like any other night. I was alone in my apartment, scrolling through social media and watching some random shows. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I glanced at the screen, an unknown number. It was strange because I rarely received calls from numbers I didn't recognize, but I figured it was probably a telemarketer. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Hello?" There was a long pause on the other end, followed by heavy breathing. It wasn't just the sound of someone taking a breath. It was deep, strained, like they were trying to stay quiet. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice shaky, suddenly uneasy. Another silence, and then a whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. "Help me." I frowned. "What? Who is this?" The voice was barely audible, but desperate. "I'm in your house." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I was alone, I hadn't heard anyone come in. The only sound was the hum of my refrigerator and the faint noise from the TV. "What do you mean? In my house?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though it felt impossible. The voice came again, clearer this time, but still filled with panic. "I'm inside. The closet. Behind you." My blood ran cold. My eyes darted to the hallway, where the closet door was barely visible. It was just a few feet away from me, hidden behind the kitchen wall. I swallowed hard, a cold sweat forming on my brow. "Stop messing around," I snapped, trying to shake off the fear creeping up my spine. But there was a sound then, a soft scrape, like fingernails dragging across fabric. I didn't move. My body locked up, every muscle rigid, but my mind was screaming to get out of there. "Turn around," the voice whispered, now almost pleading. I couldn't help it. My body reacted before my brain could even process it. Slowly, I turned my head toward the closet. The door was closed, but the sound was coming from inside. The voice, now panicked, shouted, "Please, please, don't open it." I jumped back, dropping the phone. I could hear my breath, ragged and shallow, as I scrambled to get away from the closet. My mind was spinning. It had to be a prank. It had to be. But the voice, that wasn't fake. The sound from the closet, it wasn't fake. I backed into the corner, my phone forgotten on the floor as I stared at the closet door, willing it to stay still, to remain closed. But it didn't. Slowly, the door began to creak open. I felt my stomach drop to my feet. I don't know why I didn't run. Maybe I was frozen in terror, or maybe something kept me rooted to that spot. But I watched as the door inched open, inch by inch, until it was wide enough for something to step out. But there was nothing, just darkness inside, and the sense that something was waiting. The phone on the floor buzzed again, vibrating violently. I reached for it, too afraid to look away from the closet. "Listen to me," the voice said, now so close it almost sounded like it was inside my head. "It's not me you're afraid of. It's what's behind you." I didn't even need to turn around. I knew something was there. My whole body screamed for me to run, to get out, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. Then I felt it. A breath, cold, wet, and disgusting, on the back of my neck. I didn't scream. I couldn't. All I could do was look straight ahead, paralyzed with fear as my heart raced. There was a click, followed by the distinct sound of a door locking. The closet door slammed shut, and the air in the room grew thick. I was no longer alone. Something was there. Something that shouldn't be. I finally found the strength to move, bolting for the door and running out into the hall. I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. I don't know what I thought I would see, but I didn't dare find out. I spent the night outside, huddled on the curb, my phone clutched in my hand. I couldn't bring myself to go back inside. When the sun finally rose, I returned cautiously to my apartment. Everything was quiet. The closet door was still shut, but I wasn't alone. There was a note on my kitchen counter. I didn't need to read it to know what it said. It was written in a scrawling hand, but the words were clear. "I'm still here." The voice hadn't been a prank. It wasn't a coincidence. There was something in that closet, something that waited for me. And now I knew it wasn't going to let me go.